So for the talk, I think we'll do an investigation, a direct investigation of the dualistic nature of the way the mind processes information, specifically sensory information. So this is something you can practice along with if you want to as we talk. Just work with the suggestions or look into your experience at whether these pointers are moving your attention. So if you engage any visual experience, any object of sight, whatever's seen, as a preliminary statement, I'll just say that it's because of the way we commonly experience perception. I think for most people, until they really start investigating this closely, directly, in an ongoing way, are pretty surprised by how infrequently your attention's actually in the senses, and how frequently your attention's in either some sort of reflection of the senses or more likely in your own narrative. Thinking about your practice, then thinking about yourself, then thinking about your past practices, and then thinking about work, and then thinking about money, and then thinking about your relationship, and then thinking about how hungry you are, and then so our nervous systems are complex and very good at navigating the environment, and they can reach out and grasp, so to speak, information from the visual field and the auditory field in very small pieces, and then use them to navigate, move around, interact with our environment, and so forth, and maintain an inner world, which is not necessary at all, but it's largely what the brain does. It's what it spends its time doing. So really what we're doing is we're kind of sampling the environment here and there very briefly, and then just going into an internal world and spending a lot of time there. In extreme examples of this, we've probably all been there, but we've also seen people there who are so internal, their attention's so in their head that you really start bumping into, you see people bumping into things, turning in front of oncoming traffic, like, really dangerous situations, because they're so in their mind that they're almost, you can almost call it the level of hallucination. Not necessarily hallucination in that you actually believe what you're seeing in your mind is more real than the physical world, but that there's so much attention and time spent in that internal processing that we even start to ignore what's happening externally, which can be counterproductive and essentially dangerous at some point. That's maybe a more extreme version, but I think it's fair to say that 99+% of the attention of most people is on their thoughts, is on their internal world, not the external world. Now, if you ever want to test that for yourself, just put your attention on an object of sight, on anything, a doorknob, a door jamb, a shadow, the edge of something, and just start looking at it. And pretend someone's going to give you $1 million if you can actually keep your attention on that for 5 minutes straight without having attention back in thought at all, without self-referencing. And almost no one without practice or realization, which means non-dual realization, which means that your attention is no longer constantly fixed in thought, could actually do that. So you can look at anything and see how long it takes before you're starting to self-reference again. Wondering, is this working? How's it going? I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. Or I can't do this, or I can do this. But self-referencing, coming back to actually touch into some sense of an internal, a person, a world. And it doesn't even have to be just one object. You might notice attention moves sort of to an object near it, or even to a broader visual experience. That doesn't matter as much. What really matters for this first investigation is just noticing how long attention can actually stay there. And then noticing the manner, that you don't have to, but one thing that can be helpful is to just notice the manner of self-referencing that occurs after doing something like that. What is it you're thinking about? Usually, if you're really focused on the task such as this, you're thinking about the task. Instead of seeing, you're thinking about seeing. Thinking about how you're doing at this. Which can lead pretty quickly to something like self-judgment, self-questioning, why can't I do this, etc., etc. Thinking about the process itself rather than just seeing. But the good news is you can simply return attention to sight just as easily. So I think it's helpful at first to just have some sense and awareness that, first of all, it's initially challenging to do. And second of all, unless you're pretty alert at first, you will not even notice when attention bounces back into the mind because it's just so used to being there. Now, a couple of simple adjustments you can make that can be helpful to start to keep your attention in the visual field somewhat longer. One has to do with attention or how attention appears. Because the mere act of doing this, the mere feeling or belief that you're the one doing this has a sort of side effect to it. And that is, it's very easy to bounce back into the assumption that you're the one doing it, that there's an I doing this. And thus that gives you the next thought, and then the next thought, and the next thought. And that's sort of an assumption that attention is being moved by you, or being moved by something or someone. Now, don't negate that, because if you negate that, again, it's just more thought. So that's not really helpful. Rather, this adjustment is a subtle one, but it's something I think you can probably learn or get used to. And that is, instead of, again, with attention fully in the visual, instead of feeling like we are reaching out with attention towards something, toward an object, and like trying to grasp the object or hold on to the object, try to see if you can't recognize or notice there's almost an attention or an importance that's emanating from the object itself. It may shift from a feeling of exertion, pushing or reaching out, to a feeling of more like just an observation or a simple beholding of experience. That may be helpful. The second adjustment, and if these aren't helpful or they make you think more, then that's not the point. So you don't necessarily have to listen to this part, but give it a shot. The second adjustment I'll make is when we engage a visual object, and I'm saying object as if there's a physical object, but I'm just saying it for convenience. I'm not making a statement about what's out there. When we engage something visual, when we're seeing, when there's sight, there's an assumption also similar to the assumption that there's someone looking or there's someone directing attention. There's another assumption that what we're looking at is solid, that it's like actually there, it's physical. And that's fine that we're making the assumption now. Again, we don't need to negate that directly with logic because that will just probably bind us up into our minds. Rather, forego the belief that there's something solid and consider that what you're looking at or what's there in the visual is not so much solid, almost like it might be kind of appearing again and again and again. And that makes it seem solid, something like that. So what I'm saying is if it's sort of shimmery, pixelated, or sort of there and not there at all, kind of simultaneously, none of those are right. But if you sort of pick that up a little bit, that's okay. And it might increase your interest in staying there a little longer, a little more, than if attention bounces back to the mind and starts defining and labeling. That's the solidification. That's not real. So those two adjustments can be helpful. Number one, seeing if you can't notice the interest in the object emanating from the object itself, or being intrinsic to the object itself, instead of interest being like some kind of arm that reaches out from you or your mind and grabs onto something or probes something. It's more already in that. It's already there. To be metaphorical about it, it would be the teacher is, the color is the teacher. It's not up in your mind. It's not a memory. It's not a logical statement. It's that. That's the teacher. That's where you need to look. And that's the only thing you need to see. That's the only thing you need for this. And then the second is, don't make the assumption necessarily that it's solid. Consider that what you're looking at is almost like a dynamic process. The third thing I'll say is not as much an adjustment in perception, but just a reminder, and that is, if you feel yourself tensing, tightening, your eyes are getting dry because you're keeping them open too long, straining your eyes, any of that, that's not actually necessary for this. So you can relax, just shake your body or, close your eyes for a minute, blink, and go back to the process. You don't have to strain in that way for this to clarify. It's just that when you're not used to doing this, it's something like when you look, like the first day you skied and you were really sore at the end of the day because you were struggling so much against your own body and movements and so forth. It's that sort of a thing. It's like an overcorrection. So just remind yourself it's okay to relax, take a break from doing this. Make sure the body is relaxed in a comfortable posture. Make sure your eyes aren't straining or dry, and then just stay with it. Stay with that visual experience. Now, I think for some people at this point, if you've been at this and kind of working with it, your mind is going to start doing something like, okay, but nothing's happening, or what's supposed to be happening, or what should I be expecting to be happening, or remembering, oh, what did so-and-so say that should be happening now? What did I read? That one thing that someone wrote was so good, right? You're again back in the thoughts. So just notice those practice-based thoughts, expectations. I'm not even sure at this level if it's really doubt. It's just a tendency to grab onto thoughts again. And then again, remind yourself, okay, There's no right way this has to appear. The way it appears is already the right way. Every time. It's that simple. It's stupid simple in that whatever is seen is all there needs to be. So when there's questions about what's supposed to happen, what should I see, how long do I do this until XYZ happens, expectations, it's just thoughts. It's just the attention is bounced back into thoughts again. So just return it to the visual field. Now, at the risk of making this unnecessarily complicated, I'll say that this really is all you need to do. This is enough if you're vigilant. Vigilant with when you're thinking and when you're actually experiencing the scene. So vigilant doesn't mean straining, but it means you're actually using discernment and not just, it would be very easy to start daydreaming doing something like this. You don't need any more. Again, the teaching is in what's seen, what's there, and it's an ongoing teaching. It's a dynamic, organic teaching, not a set of understandings you're going to go write about on Facebook and make sure everybody knows how your awakening journal and stuff, right? It's just experience it. It's innocence. It's an innocence of experience. So again, with risk of making it more complicated than it needs to be, you can just do this. This, I think, is really enough if there's discernment and vigilance. If you want to probe, ask questions and so forth, that's also valuable. But all the caveats come with inquiry questions that I've always put out there, and even more so with this, because it would just be so easy to stay in thoughts. But the caveats with inquiry questions are, you're never looking for an intellectual answer, of course, especially with this. And you're also not looking for your question to change the experience either. Don't ask a question and just almost like insist or wait for some explosion of color or something. That's not what the questions are for. The questions are to be a little more deliberate with discernment about what's actually being experienced. So one question you might ask with this would be, what is my evidence that that's near or far? Closer or farther? This helps if you're looking at like something like a line or where two objects seem to meet. And as you ask the question, where is my evidence for one to be closer, one to be farther, or just generally speaking, how distant this experience is? When you ask the question, you return fully to the visual, as if to look for it in there, because we're making the assumption. So let's look to see if we can empirically find the source of that information. Is it near or far? You may notice a bit of a blurring with the distance experience there, or you may not. It doesn't really matter, but you can always ask the question again, keep looking. Another question is maybe more of an extended version of the first one. That is this inside or outside? What is my evidence that this is outside? What am I referencing that this is outside? How would I know if this was inside versus outside? And we're not going to thought to answer that question. You can ask this, these sorts of questions with any seeming quality of a visual experience. For instance, where is the lightness and darkness? So if you look at the edge of something that appears dark on one side and light on the other side, or perceiving an object next to a darker object, but look directly into the field itself. Where is the lightness? Where is the darkness? What is the quality of darkness? What is the quality of lightness in immediate experience? And we can also ask, what is the evidence in the visual experience itself? What is the evidence that it's something that's there? It's a very quick assumption, a very common assumption, that there is something and it's there. Those are two assumptions. But can you find the evidence? Now, going to back up a little bit because I'm sure there's someone who's going to be watching this who, by this point, their mind is raging, going, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I know there's something out there. I know that there's objects. I know how light works. I know how the mind works. I know how eyes work." Yeah, the mind will be saying that. And I'm going to say, hopefully you already know what I'm going to say. Those are thoughts. You've been in thoughts for how many minutes now, right? This is, again, evidence to show how easy it is to bounce back into thoughts when you're doing this type of work. And if this seems like absolute nonsense, maybe back up a few steps and start investigating the nature of self and identity and I. Work on more like an awakening, first awakening kind of thing. Because before that, it almost makes no sense to investigate anything outside of a thought. Thoughts just define everything, including you and including the world. So hopefully as you work with this for some time, half an hour, daily for a week or something, you start to actually notice changes. They could be very subtle, and you may not even be able to know what they are, discern exactly what it is that's changing, but something is changing. And hopefully, or primarily, one thing that's changing is that you actually can spend a slightly more time in the visual experience before the thought machine gets turned back on. May only be a few seconds, or maybe, 30 seconds. It's really hard to judge because you'd have to start thinking and looking at clocks to figure that out. But hopefully it's noticeable that you're able to actually remain with the senses, with the visual sense for longer. And you may notice other changes. You may notice very dramatic changes too, but you don't have to. But you may notice other changes that just things do not feel so fixed in space. That's good. out there and in here is something that may feel really solid at one moment, and then all of a sudden it's just not so solid, and then maybe it feels solid again. That's totally normal. You may also notice blending of the senses when you're doing this, that sound is kind of seems to be part of the whole field of sensing, as does sensation. That's also completely normal. So back to the questions about distance and farther and closer and inside and outside. Another way of asking that, or a different way of asking that, is if you see something, you're looking at something that seems to be 10 feet away, perhaps, or across the room. Looking directly into that visual array, whether it's shades, colors, points, edges, whatever's there. Ask yourself, what is it in the actual field there, the visual experience, what would have to suddenly be added to that so that it would be 1 inch away instead of 10 feet away? What would I have to suddenly see there that's going to change its distance? And again, you're looking through it as if you're feeling through, I don't know, like a haystack with looking for a needle or something. You're in the experience, not reflecting on it logically. Does anyone have any feedback about this? If it's working, if it makes sense, if it's helpful, or if it just feels theoretical? Perfection? It is. It's pristine. Not the talk, the experience. It's pristine. It's it's aliveness. These are all just words, but yeah. It's like discovering purity again, in a way. But even crazier is discovering that it's always here. Just staring you right in the face, waiting to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's some very profound implications for this and hold this stuff very lightly, because if it's not hitting you this way in a very intimate and obvious way, then don't worry about it. But what she's saying is that when you see that that's not what you think it is, that's not the overlay put upon it, then it's not just that, it's also the ocean and the great blue sky and a dog shit and a car. There's a quote by Philip Capello Roshi, birds swim in the ocean and fish swim in the sky. Or in the Shin Ming that I read yesterday, what is not is, what is not. If this is not yet clear to you, you're far from the inner truth. So things become very magical, very paradoxical here, right? Yeah. Very importantly, it's not there at all. But it's also not there, and that's very important. It's not non-existent. It's not there at all. It's not. That's why I was saying before, there's something there. There's a couple assumptions. There's a thing, that things exist, that there's something discrete too from other things. And then the other assumption is there. What does there mean anymore? Mm-hmm.
but it felt like I was doing it.
Yeah.
So
There's a big difference between the sense of I am everything, or everything is interpenetrated with me, or consciousness is everything, arising is everything, etc., and the real non-dual taste. There's decidedly no I in it. Importantly, no I in it.
is there any way to deconstruct that?
There is, yeah, there is. But I would start with the experience of just having dualistic existence, that there's something out there and I'm in here. When you said, I don't know about dream yoga, but when you talked about dreams, the challenge I would have with applying what I'm talking about here to dreams is that it's actually a different thing. There's a non-dualistic experience of consciousness, and there's also an ability to sort of morph consciousness through intention. I never talk about doing this because it's really a sidetrack, but there's ways to morph consciousness through intention and have hallucinations and very intense visual experiences, and all kinds of altered states of consciousness. But that's all with attention still in that thought gate, the thought and consciousness gate.
So when
this is that we're learning to actually step out of that gate now. Right. Yep. You're not imposing that on it, because what'll happen, well, first of all, it's not necessarily clear seeing in the way we're talking about, but what will happen is all of the conditioned expectations, the as I was talking about, I think yesterday, the interpretations, they're all going to come to bear. You're going to turn it into what you want, and you're going to think you're manifesting it and things like that. It's not like that. It's like you become just the magnificence of the non-dual expression, or the I guess I could say the experience itself, but it basically just burns you up. There's no room for a self-referencing in that. So that self-referencing can go on for a long time, but you can train yourself to sort of peel away that tendency to keep coming back to self. It's also why, in one way, I'm kind of hesitant to talk in ways like all times and places are right there, because it's very easy to imagine what that is, to imagine that. And this isn't about imagination. Yep, that flickering is actually the tendency of the mind to grab, to reify something solid, something that's there, and your alertness is what's allowing that flickering it's the letting go to happen. It's not catching. That's kind of what we were talking about the other day with unbinding, finding the place of unbinding. Yeah, I did too. Kids are smart. They know it. It's how enjoyable it is to stare at a wall or your hands, because it's not a wall you're staring at. Teaser, that's a teaser. But yeah. So like if you look at something across the room, like whatever, that bell, for instance, just put your attention fully there. Where's your evidence for a field? Yeah, you'd have to go back into thought to think about a field. A lot of people like talking about fields and grounds of being and boundlessness and awareness. They're imagining it. Yeah, it's an imagination thing. It's imagined.
So then the seeing is only
that is the seeing. That's the seen and seeing are the same thing. It's not in anything. Well, there's another way we could imagine. Like you can imagine something emanating from it, like attention emanating from it. But that's why I was saying it's just an adjustment in the way you're perceiving, in that the interest in that is intrinsic to it. It's not like it's shining out of it or something. Or the attention is one and the same as that, rather than the way we tend to think about it, like I'm back here moving my attention out. It's just a very quick way to bounce back into the head and start thinking about where your attention is and trying to force it out onto an object. And I know this just because people tell me that. I've had people say before, like, that's what it feels like I'm doing. I'm trying to it can become struggle. Like I'm trying to merge with something, push my attention out there and like merge into that or something. But that's just sort of reifying your sense of a self back here because you're imagining that. That's imagined.
Like the one time that,
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah, the center thing is,
everywhere.
yeah, right. It's like everything is a center in a way. Mm-hmm.
It was just impossible to tell. But I guess that's.
Yeah, exactly. It's indeterminate. Yeah. But it's much more like then there's some center. I think centerness doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't make sense, but certainly it would be more like the center is kind of everywhere than there's a center here and everything is subject to it somehow or in reference to it. That's the freebie. You get the freebie, then you got to work for it after that. That's just how it is. You get these freebies, but
Did you pay for the book?
I did.
I think you just start to sense what the tension is over time, and that is, it's you're reversing a strong tendency that's been going on for a long time, and that just it feels like tension. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. It's fine, but I think the vast majority of people do something like this kind of work, and you have to, you could say exerting effort. You're not really exerting effort. It's just more of alertness and discernment, but the body will interpret it as tension when it's changing its momentum in a sense or changing its habits. That's all I think that is, honestly. One way is not right and one way is not wrong. If suddenly there's just this and that's all there ever is, and there's no sense of self ever comes back, then so be it. Probably will happen at some point. But until then, imagining that, hoping for that is not really usually that helpful. Yeah, there's something stupid easy about this. Their senses are so vivid, so powerful, and so always available. Always, every moment. We just have a strong tendency to run away from the senses and run into the reflection of the senses, which is our thought process. But they're always here, just waiting. They're not waiting, but they're always here. The access is always here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some field.
Right.
What the fuck's the field? I don't see a field. There's no field. It's in your mind.
It's the infinite awareness awareness, loving.
I don't want to make fun of it because it is actually an aspect of realization. It's like the third, or maybe you could say the fourth Oxfording picture, depending on how you define it. But I can see how it comes, because you feel like you're some discrete small thing that's very conceptual and thought-based, and you're struggling with thoughts and identity and who am I and all this. And when that blows out into the wholeness of consciousness, it's such a relief. You don't want to let go of that. But what you want to do is you want to keep expanding it outward. You want it to just keep going out into like, and sort of fade into nothingness. It starts to feel very empty. It starts to feel like, what some people might call emptiness, which isn't really what shunyata means, but they might call it formless awareness, things like that. But the interesting thing is that you could maybe say the first movement of realization is a masculine movement, not in a human gender, but masculine energetically. And then the next portion is kind of a feminine movement, actually. Adyashanti says that the first half of realization is up and out, and the second half is down and in. And many, many people miss the down and in. It just doesn't even make sense. Like, how can it be any less than absolutely nothing? How can anything be, if formless awareness is the case, there's nowhere to go beyond that. It doesn't make sense. How can you go beyond nothingness? But it's because your mindset's already trying to go towards nothingness. It's totally in an expansive modality. It's not realizing that even your ideas about expansiveness don't make sense anymore. That you have to go beyond your belief in space. In space, dimensions, subject, object, self, other, close, far, all of that stuff is going to go away. And that's not something you can imagine. The mind is structured in consciousness and awareness. The mind is structured in a sort of space. It requires that spaciousness to think, right? And so the mind itself is sort of an expansive movement in a way. But again, that's just the first big shift in realization, and maybe some of what comes after it. But what we're talking about does go beyond that. It goes beyond feeling like there is space, that there's a world you're in, that even if you are consciousness, even if you're awareness, that there's some world in which that exists, some expanse or some even potentiality that exists within. That's an illusion. That's still the mind operating, shaping reality. Yeah, these are fine adjustments we're talking about, but the implications are big experientially, and with realization, it's day and night. So, this is where I think I don't know a lot about Advaita Vedanta, but this is where Advaita Vedanta shines, and Buddhism. Buddhism goes even sort of beyond that with no self, which is just a very subtle remaining sense that can be there even with non-dual realization.
Yeah.
But there are people who clearly talk about that. The Heart Sutra. In the suttas, it's mentioned hundreds of times. This is not the self. That is not the self. This is not the self. That is not the self. Catholics have figured it out. Bernadette Roberts.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she realized it clearly.
I read that book 5 times. I don't still.
Yeah, the first 3 lines, you're like, oh yeah, she realized no self. Surprised her too. It surprises everyone.